dealing with depersonalization, and there is quite a long background before the question itself, so I'm going to read this so that all of you can relate to what is being shared here. I'm from Spain and I don't speak English well, but I really hope you can understand me and can help me. I have suffered from depersonalization since age 15, although my condition did not happen because of any spiritual practice. I felt it is as something spiritual. When I first read about enlightenment, I felt there were some things familiar to my experience. Before, when I tried to explain my sensations to other people, I used to say things like, I feel I'm aware of myself, or it is as if myself had died. Then I read those Buddhist ideas and felt that they had something in common with my feelings. But in contrast to those experiences described in Buddhism, my experiences were and are so painful and so scary that sometimes I feel I can't manage them. I would describe this as a feeling, as if I were far from reality, far from the world, as if I were in other dimension, as if myself had flown far away inside or outside me. I have met other people with similar feelings, and usually they say they feel themselves as if they were in a dream. I have come to understand why, and that is because dreaming is the most similar situation. When we are dreaming and we are almost going to wake up, we are aware of ourselves, and we know that the dream is not true. And although we move and we walk and we talk, we are aware of not being there. So this is the same feeling, except that I'm awake. So I feel as if I were in another level of awareness, but being here, so I feel as if I were trapped or condemned to be here. It is as if I were in a dream, knowing that it is a dream, but I could not wake up and had to spend the rest of my life living inside a dream, in a fake reality, while others are integrated in that reality, but I'm aware of everything. This idea scares me. So this idea makes me feel as if I were falling and there were nothing to grab onto, as if I were alone, flowing in another galaxy and nobody is in my dimension. On the other hand, I feel as if I were trapped inside my body and I would like to get out. But since I know that it is not possible, I get panic attacks because I feel I cannot cope with the fact of being a prison inside my body. While I have these sensations, I'm constantly wondering what I am or what are all these things that surround me. When I ask myself these questions, I have a sensation of panic. Question. What I would like to know is if you think there is any connection between my experiences which were not triggered by any spiritual practice, but by trauma in my childhood and drug use. I'd like to know if what causes this detachment from myself could be managed through spiritual practice. I just want to be happy and enjoy my existence and be okay with my nature. Please help me to do so. Well, it's rather well articulated. I understand absolutely every line, even though perhaps Daryananda brushed it up into a more coherent English, but what you have expressed is just as clear as the day, as they say in English. First of all, I want to respond to part of your question, that yes, this is remedial. In other words, there is a possibility to address and adjust this, what causes you disconcern, essentially, due to the fact that there is perhaps that what otherwise works as a protecting filter, which is filtering everything that we receive through the senses. In fact, senses themselves could be considered those filters of otherwise inconceivably overwhelming reality, if we use reality from the capital R here, that this human organism would not be able to withstand it even for a split of a second, if only the whole gamut of what is the fullness itself. So therefore, we can say that these objects, these senses, these sensory perceptions, act as both filters of reality, of ultimate reality, as well as the doorways or windows into this reality. This is where tantric practices and tantric philosophy is unique. But I will leave this for a time being and come back to it at a later stage, because this question and what you have posed here requires quite a careful approach. So first part of my response is that yes, be very positive that this can be addressed and remedied through appropriate spiritual practices, through appropriate spiritual attitude, I would even say. Now, what you're asking here also, in a part of your question, is that whether this is related to some kind of trauma in your childhood and drug use, which you do not state clearly. What kind of drug use? What do you mean by that? Whether this is medication or some recreational drugs that used by you or your parents, I'm not quite sure, because no much background is being given. So I would say that yes, of course, everything is possible. Everything is possible. The childhood years, it's that what forms this individuality. The childhood years, the very first years of our childhood, is entirely what we are. Everything else essentially is God. The very first few years of growing up, of actually getting to use these sensory perceptions as the very, very channels through which we then form the idea of this world. And when we say we form the idea of this world, inevitably that idea of the world molds us. So you have this here symbiotic mutual relationship. Just as we form the idea about the world, that idea we have essentially gradually forms us. You see? Two-way process. Of course, we could say it's not a two-way process. It's just one indivisible reality. But let's go and proceed slowly. In this language, where subject and object reigns, where the subject and object essentially are predominant experience, by subject and object we mean this observer and that reality outside of the observer. When observer and that what is being observed is our daily experience, then all this remains intact. Our formation, the formation of our personality, of our individuality, is inseparable from these forming years. As we acquire what this world is about, we inevitably shape ourselves. Philosophers in the past have tried to explain the relationship of what we perceive through the senses with the idea of the cave, that famous Plato's cave. Plato was a philosopher in ancient Greece during the classical time. And he came up, essentially, he didn't invent that, but it is attributed to him. But he just elaborated more and made it into a very, very clearly delineated almost system of understanding that what we perceive as the world is in fact an analogy of us sitting with our back to the entrance to the cave and watching the shadows on the wall of the cave from the creatures and objects and life that happens outside of the cave as they pass by. And we make minute association with everything that appears on the wall of that cave with the corresponding sound that we hear. We make that into our reality. This is what Plato's cave said to exemplify how our mind, equipped by the senses, gains and gives us this perceptual understanding of the world. From there on, it goes unquestioned. From there on, most people, I would say, I don't know, I'm not here to come up with precise number of percentage in terms of percentage, but I would say maybe 95% of people out there never question reality that they live in as if there is a greater reality. Everything that they perceive through the senses and interpret with their minds, it's all there is. Some of them appears to be quite okay with that. Others even seem to be happy as long as they are satisfied on a daily basis. The roof there, the vehicle to drive, the pension plan, the mortgage at hand, or maybe some inheritance. Life goes unquestioned. Okay, I'm simplifying it a little bit to make it more kind of comprehensible and graspable. But with this other, let's say 5 or however many percentage of the human population, that is not so. For some, that veil of reality, as it were, being torn. For some, they essentially turned around from that shadowy display on the wall of the cave towards the aperture of the cave, to behold where that projection comes from. Yet others actually perhaps made an effort to get out of the cave itself and to behold the reality. And the further elaboration of that myth goes that those who come out of the cave, usually overwhelmed with such a beatitude and bliss and madness of realizing that things are not at all how they perceive it to be, that they rush back to the cave and start screaming into the cave, "Hey guys, guess what? It's not at all how you thought it is. Not at all. Please come in." But many think that, wait a minute, what's this voice coming from? He's a nutter. This is the show. I've been watching it all my life. It's in front of me. Why do I need to go somewhere? Why do I need to even turn my head? I'm fascinated by this appearance of shadows on the wall of my mind, on a wall of my consciousness, as it were. Whether this analogy is accurate or not is beside the point. It is perhaps that you belong to this 5% of people. Again, this is random, by the way, arbitrary, so don't hold on to it. For whom reality is not at all as it appears to be to the senses only, but much more to it. Much, much more to it. Therefore, first of all, I'd like you to get rid of any idea that somehow there is a sense of pathology, that there is a sense of something is wrong with you. Because what is wrong and what is right are modalities of what we have decided, in inverted commas. Literally sat down and decided, this is okay and that is not okay. This is good and this is bad. Yes, some of this we could argue is universal, right? Do not steal, do not hurt another, and so forth. The commandments and all these codes of conduct, of course, are universal. But within the realm of what we're experiencing, everything is essentially a decision, what one perceives. When you get someone who is so linear in their thinking and very mathematical, in the same, let's say, boat, or put them at the same table with a poet, they have a very different perceptual capacity to relate to what they experience. For the poet, numbers makes no sense, no reason, nothing. For the poet, he doesn't give a hoot of what this reality and how this reality is quantifiable. For her, as a poet, everything is in the flux of words and poetic lines, in rhymes and rhythms and cadences of the sounds, in the invocation of the metaphor that words bring and how they reverberate through the body. For the one who has more mathematical setup, for him or her, reality is a wonder of this mathematical genius. Everything is numbered, quantified. This person perceives the world literally, in a very different way. Not that one is more superior and inferior, don't get me wrong at all. This comparison is not given in terms of one has more of an upper hand than the other. We're talking about poetic genius and mathematical genius. They have very different capacity to perceive this world. What is real for one is irrelevant and not even there for another. So, if we understand that, then already we have to understand that some people are more physical. Some people are much more physical, perhaps physical to the degree where they connect to the world of physicality, and through physicality, through that, what grounds them, and all this otherwise flies over their head. Other people are much more bound by unbounded flight of imagination. They are constantly in a dream world of their minds. They are not at all, as it were, grounded. It's almost like you want to ground that person and put them on the earth and maybe let them wear heavier shoes, otherwise they kind of take off in no time. So between these two extremes, every other shade is included. Some people are physical, and that physicality can be very refined. They're physical, but they connect also to the world through intuition. They connect to animal world. They connect to the sounds of nature. You just sit there watching sunset somewhere in the ocean, and that only has a value for you of the colors and the beauty that it invokes to your retina. But for another person, there are sounds in nature. The air has a certain quality to it. The movement, the cloud, the way the sun sets in, the way the light shimmers on the horizon. And that person feels the weather is changing, something changing in nature. So they are connected, they are very, very physical, but they connect through that physicality to the more hidden dimension of reality. You see, even with that physical realm. Another person may be completely in a dream state, more in a dreamy state of being completely out there in the realm of imagination. The physical has very little importance to that being. It does have. When we get hungry, we'll get hungry. When the tummy wants some food, mathematician, poet, painter, Einstein, and Picasso all gather to the kitchen and start opening their fridges. When tummy wants to eat, we all take care of that. Once we've covered this, I want you to now consider that what you have described in the first part of your lengthy background as whether this, what happens to you, to your perceptual ability of this world, is caused by some causeless matters, or in fact by some spiritual or non-spiritual matters involved. Again, it's a matter of perspective. It's not necessary that you have to be involved in spiritual practices for you to have this relationship with the world. Tremendous role played here by the way your individuality is formed by this minute combination of planetary energies, aka astrology. And I'm not talking about astrology on the pedestrian or kind of high street understanding of that. Astrology can be understood as, oh, there is something to read about, what might happen or might not happen, or what are we currently going through. And there is a different understanding of astrology, that all this is indeed soul's journey through the realm of incarnation. Soul's journey, there's a trajectory. The soul traverses this created realm of form and phenomena. And the soul here has a unique hue, unique combination based on some total of actions performed. It is known as karma. Some people do not accept karma. In modern spirituality, you will find teachers, speakers who reject the notion of karma. But we replace the term karma with the scientific term cause and effect. And then it has a very different understanding. Everything essentially has a cause, and every cause brings an effect. And the two are inseparable as two parts of the circle. This essentially, the law of cause and effect is also a scientific reality. It's a scientific law. The law of cause and effect. Energy is indestructible. Scientists tells us that one cannot destroy energy. Yes, we can extinguish fire by throwing some water on it, or by blowing air if it's enough and if the fire is not too strong, and the fire will be extinguished. But that does not mean that we extinguish the energy of fire. Just like fire is present in the wood when wood doesn't even burn. In the same way, energy has, let me reword it, everything in the universe has a certain quality to it, a certain quality. And that quality is predetermined by minute combination and composition of that energetic setup. You cannot dissolve, you cannot destroy it. A total annihilation, let's say, of a world is not annihilation of energy. Energy would have to be transformed into something else, but it will always remain energy. It is that understanding, or with that, equipped with that understanding, we can then begin to comprehend the notion of cause and effect. And that cause and effect is at play at birth of a human being, because that birth, literally, marked by creation of a blueprint of what we know as soul being in the body, spirit being in the body. And we go through life sometimes when certain planets, certain combination of planets, have more influences than others. If, for example, one is going through a phase of the moon, if predominant influence of one's life is the moon, Luna, one will have a very imaginative time, but also very dreamy time. If one, let's say, is an artist, a writer, a musician, and one is in touch with one's creativity, this could mark as one of the most creative phases in one's life, because one would be filled with ideas, filled literally with ideas, filled with imagination. But if one is not, one may be plucked, literally, consumed by all this ideation, and dream. One will lose the contact with reality. One will become completely lost in the world of fantasy. These are just examples I'm giving you, so that you consider that there is more perhaps at play than just thinking that, okay, there were something happened early in your life and there were certain influences in your life. That you mentioning Buddhism here, reading that some certain postulates and certain expositions, that when you contemplated on them, that it all made sense to you, but at the same time frightened you. Which brings us to that part of your question, very important part, where you say that you are feeling essentially terrified by these experiences, that you don't know who you are and what you are in this world. And where is that connection between that what observes and witnesses all these phenomena and that what is your own body? This is where we come squarely to the crux of spiritual realizations. Essentially, what you describe is actually a very desirable outcome for someone who, let's say, gave themselves to the practice of self-inquiry, for someone who has been practicing certain disciplines, certain spiritual applications, which literally designed to loosen the grip of awareness, or rather grip of the body on our awareness. It's another matter, of course, it's another topic altogether. How can the body, how can this organism have any grip on awareness? But in the context of replying to your question, I'd like to kind of get away with this, because this, obviously what we call the body, is a conglomerate of mind, ego, intellect, and the senses all together. All this causes a grip, and this identification with this living organism is so intense that one requires to engage in spiritual practices to loosen it up. Because unless it's loosened up, life can become unbearable. One would constantly think that one is the reason for one's own calamity, and so forth. Well, likewise, one is the reason for one's own joys and misery, which in itself is true from both perspectives, from both poles of understanding. But the understanding from the perspective of the what is known in spiritual discourse as the lower self, or non-self, or the perspective of the individuality, or the perspective of the ego, is a very painful perspective. Because then one lives as if in the cage of one's own making. Therefore, spiritual practices. And there comes a time when this whole structure, which has been questioned before, begins to loosen up. And when it loosens up, to a degree when one no longer feels, as it were, that, oh, this is, I know and I can put my finger on exactly what I am with all my story, there comes a time of a sudden and very unnerving realization that if I'm not this, that what am I? And that could be like a cliffhanger. It's almost like a breathtaking vertical drop into the abyss of not knowing who we are. So I want to pave the way now for you to understand what you have experienced for a long time, perhaps since childhood, is actually the very leitmotif of early spiritual realization. It's a leitmotif of spiritual realization where standing at that sheer drop, at the abyss of not knowing of who we are, is a prerequisite. It is actually desirable. It is what some of the spiritual practices bring on due to the manipulation of the pranic flow, like certain yogic practices, or continuously being involved in some kind of more intellectual enterprises, more intellectually based methodologies. Maybe that is the practice of self-inquiry, of what am I, who am I beyond this appearance, who am I beyond the senses, where the senses are. Okay, who am I beyond the mind, who am I beyond the intellect, who am I beyond the ego, and so forth. With you, perhaps, it happened spontaneously. We don't know, by an act of grace, or maybe you've done spiritual practice in previous lives. And then somehow, without certain guidance in this life, without appropriate guidance, you never quite manage to reconcile your experiences with the foundational grounds of certain spiritual approaches. And then again, the chosen path, a chosen methodology, has to be compatible with your inner requirements and with your, I would even say, temperament. If the Buddhist, and when you speak about Buddhism, when you mentioned Buddhism earlier on, the Buddhist ideas, and you say that here, in contrast to those experiences described in Buddhism, Buddhism have many different schools, many different, some of them are very, very differ greatly from other Buddhist perspectives and philosophies. So we cannot just say that all Buddhism agrees in its doctrines. But if that what you have suffered from, that sense of the lack of understanding of who you are, what you called depersonalization, or perhaps the question itself, aching to that theme of depersonalization, then Buddhism may not be the best place for you to draw the answers. Simply because Buddhism, many of the Buddhist doctrines deny the existence of the self. According to Buddhism, there is no such thing as a living being. It's a dream indeed. It's a dream within consciousness. There is no such thing as this living jiva, or this living soul. They don't believe in Atma. It's very different from, let's say, Hindu, Tantric, Vedantic perspectives. Not that it is different when we speak ultimately of what the teaching of Buddha was, but some of the Buddhist interpretations, some of the Buddhist doctrines simply do not see this living organism as an entity at all. Therefore, if you delve into this with your given condition, that will only perhaps exacerbate and only make it even more confusing, because something that you have been suffering from requires a certain integration, if not grounding. And these ideas of prevalent in many Buddhist doctrines are better for those who actually too grounded in this life, too attached to this phenomenal experience, too attached to this physical reality. You see, so even here, the methodology and the philosophy chosen can be helpful or can be less helpful. In turn, I would suggest you try to understand this from the perspective that what we call physical realm, that's what you call yourself, even your own body, essentially is inseparable from what is aware of all that. It's not that it is real or unreal. It's not that the reality itself is real or unreal. Reality is the way we perceive it. There is this term, the world is as you see it. The world is as you see it. It's a leitmotif of the great scripture, great Advaita Vedantic scripture, called Vashishta Yoga. And from time to time, the Guru Vashishta would remind his student Rama, which the scripture is based on, the dialogue of Vashishta and Rama. Rama in his late teenage years, when he came to the crisis of identity and crisis of existence, that led to the dialogue in front of the other members of the court, that Rama was a prince. Periodically, Vashishta would say that the world is as you see it. So, applying this understanding is that if we perceive this reality as illusory, then this reality will have to become illusory sooner or later. If whatever we perceive, our reality becomes essentially influenced by our perception. And taking us back to the early years of formation of our understanding of the world, it is very much so. It is very much how we learned first about this being in the world in a physical form, and that in turn shaped us and all the other experiences along the way. And then we have this world. So, but that is not fixed or not written in stone. And this is where spiritual practices can be very, very helpful, in a sense that one can either loosen the grip of that physical reality on one's awareness, or one can ground one's awareness when it's no longer feels comfortable in the body. And that seems to be the case with your question. So you need to be given to these practices which are more grounding, where you can find actually again this comfort in being in the world. But how can you find comfort? Comfort comes primarily through the contact of the senses with the objects. In other words, you need to reverse that where some try to get away from and re-establish that connection with the world, and at the same time not to be afraid of that panic that rises from who am I in reality if I'm not this world, if this world is receded to a dream or an idea. Obviously you are awareness, you are that. Awareness, you've heard and read it enough about it, whether Buddhist perspective, Neo-Advaitic perspective, non-duality perspective. It's that. I'm not a religious theologist, so I don't speak from the perspective that there is God and that you are soul. In the basis of Hinduism states that Atma is Brahma, or Atman is Brahman. Atman is a soul, and Brahman stands for absolute. And that equation there, that soul is absolute. And of course it's easier said than actually cognitively experienced. But that's what in reality all of us are. All without exception. There's not that someone is more absolute than the other. One's experience may be more or less, but it makes no difference on the core of our reality. So, knowing that we are awareness and nothing else, awareness, one without a second, then what is the reason for panic? Why to panic? Then what is panicking here? What is panicking here is a psychophysiological responses. In other words, it's a response of the organism. And that's where you are required to look into. You could have your physiology simply disturbed for many, many, many years. That element that rules nervous system, the air element, may be chronically affected. And your nervous system is in that borderline of constantly firing, constantly being overexposed. So that's where the healing touch needs to be applied. This is where spiritual practices which aimed at grounding meditations, grounding activity, grounding interactions, relationships, not these ephemeral experiences through the internet or ethernet, but actually going to the garden and digging the earth, working with plants. If you are a man doing masonry job, carrying the weights, working with animals, cooking, making a dough, making bread, putting your hands into a mud, making a crockery, making a vase out of clay. In other words, reconnecting to the earth. Reconnecting to the earth through the act of direct experiencing. You see? And you never know. Something amazing and totally unexpected might happen as you are trying to ground yourself. So do consider all this, please. And of course, it's needless to say, is that when something is very serious like this, you need to have a mentor, you need to have a teacher, you need to come to retreats, you need to come to workshops, and it goes without saying. So I don't need to do self-promotion here. It's just to save you time and to save us the time for beating about the bush. It's an English idiom which means essentially going around the theme rather than saying it in a direct and straightforward manner.